So jumping right into this project, the first thing that the book calls for is some fretwood. Now, I could not find any quote-unquote fretwood that was commercially available. Essentially, it's just plywood that where all of the layers are the same thickness and the same species. Now, through the magic of editing, I can make it look like I am super good at creating my own homemade plywood. Now, that is not the case at all. This was actually a lot of work and rather difficult. I actually have an entire video dedicated to my adventures in do-it-yourself plywood. I was able to get something that I was rather happy with. It took a couple of attempts and way too much money. But it was really important for me to make this in the way it would have been made in 1907. If you want to see a deeper dive into DIY plywood, I'll leave a link to that video in the description. The next part to make was what the book refers to as moldings. And ideally, you just leave this as one single long piece and then do all the shaping, while it's about 5 foot or so long. That wasn't going to work out for me. The piece I was working with had a little bit of a dog leg in it, and I was going to burn through way too much wood trying to get it flat and straight. So I actually ended up cutting it up like you see here, and then doing all my operations on every single piece. So now I've cut my miters and I'm just test fitting them right now. The shooting board set to a 45-degree angle really helped dialing those in. A mitered shooting board would be a lot better for this task, but I don't cut miters a lot, so the standard one works real well. And so now I'm just double checking it square, just using the ruler, measuring corner from corner. The pinch rods I have would have made this so much easier, but I've misplaced them in the move. Now the inside of all of these pieces needs to be beveled. This is where leaving it long would have been beneficial, because I had to come through and try to fit every corner to itself. I wasn't real concerned with getting the bevel exact on every single piece. My main concern was it look right instead of it being an exact number, but at the same time all of the corners match up. And really this is all visual, so there's not a lot of measuring. It's mostly take off some shavings, test fit, take off some shavings and test fit, and then repeat until it's done. To actually do the bevels, I drew a line on the top and I drew a line on the bottom, and then I just connected those with the hand planes. First with a block plane, used that as like my rough plane to take off most of the waste, and then come back with a smoother. And what you saw me using there was some tape with a little bit of super glue to stick it down to my bench. It just made it easier to hang on to it. So now the moldings all need to be shaped, and it does not get rounded over the whole length of the piece. It's only rounded over in the middle, and there's 1.5 inches, 2 inches or so on either end that stays flat. So it was a lot of just files and a spoke shave and then sandpaper to kind of get those rounded over. And now I'm going back over with an infill miter plane that I actually made to just kind of smooth the insides of those bevels a little bit more. So if you want a real easy way to see where your tear out is, after you've scraped it, go back over it with some fine sandpaper, like 320, 400, something like that. That sanding dust will get caught in the tear out, and then you can go back again with a scraper to get all of it out. So now on to glue up. I just laid some wax paper down on the bench just to help with the squeeze out. And this is regular, white glue. I find that dries a lot clearer than the yellow glue. And I'm just using a picture frame clamping jig to hold it all together. And now again with this little infill plane, which, man, I gotta say, having a tiny smoothing plane is so helpful on smaller things like this. I'm just flushing up the joints and working a little bit from one direction and a little bit from the other, just to make sure that top is perfect. Having all those pieces be hand cut, the height on each one is just slightly different. The baselines will all be the same. The bottoms are all level, but the tops need a little work. just to make sure they're the best they can be. So now after glue up, I'm just coming back in with some hardware store dowels and sinking those into the ends there just to help hold that together a little more. A purely mitered edge is not the strongest. It needs a little support. Now they will have some copper hardware is going to cover all that up, so I'm not too worried about how those pegs look. All right, so now I'm working on the bottom again. This is plywood. It's but they're thick veneers. They're 16-inch thick veneers, so I can actually plane on them without worrying about burning through the veneer. And I did need a bit of a round over, so just hitting that on the router. And again, this little plane came in so handy. Just using it here to smooth out everything. Now, what you saw me doing with the Veritas smoothing plane earlier, I actually had a toothing blade in it, so that lets me plane in all directions without the risk of tear out, and which was really needed on this because that walnut is actually has some figure to it, and I don't know about you guys, but I always have the hell of a time with walnut. It seems to want to tear out on me all the time. So for finish prep, it's plain, it's scrape and then sand. That seems to work well for me, and that's not my idea. I actually got it from a Peter Nicholson book, like I said earlier. I have a video on that too, so I'll leave that video link in the description if you want to find out more about it. Now I need to assemble the box for the first time. Now I'm trying to get the frame roughly centered, even all the way around on that plywood. And you see me now going in and drawing a line where I actually need to put all of the screws. This being plywood, I don't have to worry about that bottom expanding and contracting on me. So now this is just drill a hole, put in a screw, and then move over, drill a hole, put in a screw, and just rinse and repeat till it's all done. I probably put in more screws than I need, but that's what we're doing. Time to finish, and the first thing I'm going to do is hit it with a light coat of this medium yellow dye. It's a real weak solution, and that's just to help bring out the colors a little bit more once the top coat's applied. And for a top coat, I'm actually using some wipe-on polyurethane. I figured that gives me the most amount of time to get something cleaned up if I spill all over it. I just apply enough coats to where it looks about the same as it did wet as it does dry. Alright, so now it's time to make all of the hardware, and the book calls for copper hardware, so I have some copper sheeting, and I'm just taping all those patterns down and going through and cutting them out. And I did this a little bit backwards. I should have cut these as squares first, put on one pattern, and ganged them all up. And actually, what you kind of see me doing here, I've taped them all together with double stick tape, and I'm just coming in now with a Dremel to try to clear out most of that waste. So after the Dremel, just to get a lot of the material gone, I'm coming in with files and just progressively working finer and finer the lines. And you can see on there's some blue layout fluid, and I'm just using that to see where I filed and where I haven't. And now I'm coming in and giving it kind of like the final polish. And I'm not entirely sure that I needed to do this last step, because you're going to see me here in a second start beating on these with a hammer. And what I noticed was the finish that was on the hammer was the finish that I actually ended up getting on those parts. So I don't know, if I try it again, ever do it in the future, I might be able to save myself some time sanding. And you can kind of see what they look like there. So those were my corner pieces. Now I'm working on my handles, and this was one that I could not get my brain wrapped around how it was going to work until I just started making it. And just have a piece of 1/2 inch, low carbon steel there, and I'm using that as a form. And every now and then I'll come back through and heat it with a torch, because the copper will work harden as you hit on it, and the torch just helps to soften it back up and and makes it easier to move around. Now applying some brass black to all of this to actually discolor the copper. The same thing for these, brass screws. I actually went through with a jeweler's brush to kind of knock all the lacquer off that was on there. All right, now it's time for final assembly. I let that finish cure for about a week. Rubbed it out with a brown paper bag, and no wax or anything like that. It doesn't need it. So these are just some stick-on feet. Decided to throw those on because I didn't want to scratch up my coffee table. Now this is the most stressful part of the entire build. I needed to drill teeny tiny little holes to fit all the hardware on without drilling through the sides or snapping off my drill bit or marring up the finish with a slip screwdriver. And then so right there is just showing kind of what it looks like, and I actually went through and clocked on my screws. I know you don't need to, but there's two types of people: those that clock their screws and those who are wrong. And then just a couple more taps of the hammer just to make sure that copper is fully formed to the molding. And, I didn't try to minimize the gaps where I can. Again, like I said, taking the time just to clock the screws, and now just giving it a double test with excellent camera work. And so here's the finished piece. I am absolutely thrilled with the way this one turned out. I think I got it pretty close to what the book calls for. Again, if you want to check out that book, it's called Cabinet Work and Joinery. It's by Paul Hasluck, and it was originally printed in 1907. Thank you for tuning in. I sincerely appreciate it. Likes, thumbs up, subscribes, all that stuff. If you want to do all of it, it helps out the channel. Thank you. If not, that's cool too. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on the next one.